So this is what my dress looks like so far. It's a little hard to see all of it here. Here's my skirt attached. Okay, everything's been pressed. Now we're going to cover two things at the same time. One of them is stitching the bodice closed and also the hem. So for the bodice top, we basically need to get the lining and all of these selvages on the inside. And what I mean by that is this is where your skirt and your bodice are attached. The reason we press this open and up is so that we could take the 5/8 that we had pressed under on the lining and put that on top of this, and then that is going to hide all of that. Okay? So now to get rid of some excess bulk, I'm going to just trim this out a little. So I'm just going to trim away some of this excess fabric here. And that will just make the dress feel a little better. Alright, so this doesn't take but a minute. Just be careful that you don't cut through your dress anywhere. Anywhere that you're not supposed to, I guess I should say. I want some extra threads here, so I'm going to trim those out too. Alright. Anytime you're cutting anything that you're sewing, if you can hold the pieces up and above, I would always recommend that. I ruined so many projects when I very first started learning how to sew because I would just accidentally cut through things, and that's a heart-sickening feeling when you've spent hours working on something just to cut through it. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. Not that I really have any enemies. There we go. Okay, so that trims out all the excess fabric. Now it's the same principle as sort of earlier when we were matching up our skirt and our top. We just want to make sure that seams match up. So I will match up this dart and then just start putting pins in. Match up this dart, and you can either go ahead and start stitching all of this together. You'll need to stitch it by hand. I'm going to do mine a little bit differently, and that's because I haven't done a fitting on this. Usually when I work with Vogue patterns, they fit me really well, so I don't normally have to do a lot of fitting. I'm very lucky in that sense that I know how to cut their patterns because they're so consistent with their fit that I can usually get it right without having to make too many alterations. But what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to hand stitch this little section together, and then I'm also going to hand stitch from this dart to the end, and also the same thing on the other side from this dart to the end. And I'm going to leave these sections open so that I can try the dress on after I finish the buttons and everything. And if I need to make an alteration, I can open this up very easily and just tighten it if I need to, make it a little looser, make it a little smaller. If I need to make alterations in a Vogue pattern, it's usually going to be a little bit at the waist on the inside, or at the sides I should say, or sometimes in the back, like where a zipper would be. But in this case, I don't want to touch the back because I'm going to have all those buttons, and that would just be a hassle to try to do a fitting through there. So I'm going to leave those sections open. So I will just show you now. To hand stitch the inside here, you're basically just going to do slip stitch. So I have my needle and my thread here, and I'm just going to use about an arm's length of thread. you guys can't see, but I switched to a Christmas Santa shirt, even though it's in the middle of summer, because my room is freezing. I'm not sure why it's so cold today, but it is. I guess all of the rain that we got. So I now match the project that I'm working on. Alright, and then I'm using a double thread just because it's a little stronger, and I never have hand stitching break, but I always have this irrational fear that my hand stitching is going to break, so I always use a double thread. Alright, so I just knotted that twice, and then I'm going to cut off the ends. And I'll zoom the camera in here so you can see what this stitch looks like. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just take my thread through the lining here, and that's just because I want to hide that knot at the end. And then to make a slip stitch, I'm just going to grab a little bit of the right side of the fabric and then just put it through the lining. And these don't have to be really small, just consistent. So I can take that pin out now. You can do these pretty quickly too. So once again, just grabbing a little of the right side of the fabric. You just want to grab like a thread or two. It really shouldn't show through when you get done. Okay, and you can make them fairly big also. Right. It's easier to do if you're holding it. You still see this? So just grab a little bit of the right side of the fabric, then put it through the lining. I can usually do this really quickly, but I'm trying to hold it so that you guys can see it, so it's taking me longer. Okay. If you get one that does a little pucker like that, just pull it through. That happens a lot when you're using a double thread. Alright. And you'll just keep going through like that, and you can either keep sections of it open if you think there's a chance you may have to do a fitting, or you can go ahead and close this up if you feel comfortable. Okay? So do as much of that as you want depending on how you think you'll need to do your fitting. And I'm also going to show you how I'm going to do the hem. So I'll leave this for now, and just to show you quickly on the opposite side, this is what it looks like on the opposite side. You probably can't even tell. The stitching is here, but that's just how fine the stitching is. You can't even see it. So that is a slip stitch. Now for the hem, I'll go ahead and zoom out again so you guys can see this next part. Now even though I am working with skirt D, they use, they use braid for their hem, but I prefer the hemming method that they used for view H. So I went ahead and used view H. So here's my skirt with the top up here and the bottom of the skirt down here, just so you know what you're looking at. So here is the back of my dress. This is the part that we interfaced and we finished the edge, and then we turned it in, and this got basted at the top but it's loose at the bottom. So this is what we're going for at the end here. So just to show you, there. So this is what we're looking to do. So in order to recreate that, I'm going to flip this to the inside. So let me do that again because I want you guys to get this. This is the bottom of the skirt. Okay, so just like so. Okay? And you're just folding it over the width of the interfacing. and then I'm going to pin this once, and this is going to be put through the sewing machine at 2 inches above the hem. So you can use your tape measure, and this is how I do it, and I measure 2 inches, and then I put a pin through so that I know where 2 inches is, and then I sew across that line. Now, because I've already done the other side, I'm also going to be checking to make sure that these are even on both sides. Okay, so this is 2 inches. Now I just want to compare it to the other side. And we need to get this exactly matched up exactly as we would wear it. So let's say if this dress lays perfectly from the way that it's made here, will these 2 lines match up? This one I'm going to move just a little higher. Okay, because you really want these to be even when you get done. You want your hem to be even. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch this, and I'll let you see that. So I'm using a regular stitch. This is where I just made my line for where I'm going to sew. I'm just going to put the needle in, then stitch, back stitch, do it again, and then I'm just going to follow that line that I made with the needle here, or the pin I should say. And then when I get to the end, I'll back stitch again. All right, now we go back to the table. So this is now what we have, looking at our hem. This is the one I already did. This is the one that we just sewed together. And now I'm just going to trim out that excess fabric, and this is just trimming out on the top. See that? And then I'm going to trim the rest of this as well. So I just like that hemming method better. I don't think you need to use the braid and go through all of those extra steps unless you just want to try it. I've always liked hems like this. I think they look really pretty. And then they will get folded inwards. Okay, I'll do both of these so you can see what it looks like. Alright, so we folded those out. And now if you lay this flat, as if it had the buttons done, that finishes the corners of your hem. So this is what this looks like after these are turned in, okay? So this is a lot of steps that I'm showing you at once, but this prepares you to do a lot of the hand stitching, which is why I like showing it to you all at the same time. So after you have done this with the hem, you can go to your couch or TV or, you know, wherever you feel most comfortable. I'm about to go to the TV and watch anime, and you can finish slip stitching your bodice closed. So this is your bodice lining to the skirt, and it's going to hide all those selvages, so you can finish doing all that slip stitching. And then your hem down here, since you've already done the corners like this, it shows you how high you're going to be stitching, hand stitching I should say, your hem. So now I can also hand stitch this, and there are 2 ways that I would recommend doing this. You can either finish this raw edge to help keep it from fraying, like we did the interfacing before, where I just kind of used a zigzag stitch, or you can actually turn it under like so. This is probably what I'm going to do. So I will go through, because I know I turned this up 2 inches, so that means 2 inches is what I would like to use all around. Okay, so you can go through at your seams and mark what's going to be 2 inches. You can also use what you cut off as a sort of guide if you want to be super lazy about it. However, I think you're always going to get a better measurement actually using the tape measure, so use the tape measure if you can. So fold these up 2 inches and then turn under 5/8 your hem, like so, and then repin it, and you can hand stitch all of that down at the same time. So I like this method because I like to sit down and do as much of the hand stitching all at the same time as I can. Sometimes I can get through a whole mini series if it's the right project. Alright, so there's 2 inches on that one. I'll go ahead and fold under about 5/8. Put a pin in there. Same thing in the middle. Alright, 2 inches, 5/8. Put a pin in there. Alright, so that is a lot of hand stitching. That should keep you busy for a while. So go ahead and finish your hand stitching. I'm going to work on my hand stitching, and I'm going to leave, just as a reminder, I'm going to leave the sides open for a while just so I can do a fitting and make sure I don't need to make any major alterations through there before I completely close it up. Do all of that and then come back and join me again. This is what the hem looks like now that I've stitched it all by hand. It's very pretty. And I gave it a very good pressing after I was done, so it's nice and flat. And it hardly shows through at all. In fact, it's extremely difficult to see any of the stitching. So I'm very happy with my hem. The next part that we're going to be doing is adding our hook and eyes and actually attaching the buttons. So one thing that I would recommend, oh, that's my iron. Thank you, iron. I'm aware that you are hot and ready to go. One thing that I would recommend that you do is heat up your iron and then repress this just so that it looks nice and lays flat before you start sewing buttons on. Okay, so just fold it in. It's just that interface part that gets folded under, and then just give that a pressing so it's nice and flat and ready for you to add your buttons. Do that on both sides. And before I do my buttons, which are actually going to be the very last thing that I do, we need to add a hook and eye to our neck strap here, okay? So I'm going to go grab my scissors, my needle and thread, and 2 hook and eyes and show you how to do this part next. So following the outline that's in the pattern instructions, they have one side like this in the back. And actually, I think it'll be easier to see if I move the dress itself out of the way. Oh yes. Okay, so this is my neck, and one side needs to lap slightly over the other. So they have it in the instructions like this, but also I would recommend that you just look at your straps and see which one you think would look better on top. You can see with mine that this side turned out just a little bit wider than this one, so I chose to put it on top, which just happens to mimic the instructions in the pattern instructions, because if I had done it the other way, you would have seen this strap popping out further underneath, so this will hide that and keep it more seamless. So take a look at that before you start. The other thing is my hook and eyes look slightly different than what they have. This is what I happen to have at home right now, so I wanted to use what I already had. Okay, so mine are the rounded hook and eye instead of the straight one. So because of that, I had to be very mindful before I started stitching this on here to make sure that I put my hook far enough over that whenever I closed this, you wouldn't see these loops sticking out unattractively on the other side. So Depending on what kind of hook and eye you're using for your project, you might need to be very careful of that. That's just one thing to consider. So I have my other hook because I need to add 2 here. And I'm going to put this one also close to the edge, and I wanted to show you the layout here, but it's easier for me to sew it this way, so I am going to flip it because I'm right-handed. So I will match this up equally with the other one as best as I can. Don't put them too close in the middle. You want to put them further out towards the edges because it will help keep the neck straight and back. And then using my double threaded needle here, I'm just going to start sewing that down by hand. It's awkward trying to sew this for camera. Hope you guys can see this. I mean, it's fairly simple. You're just tacking it to the fabric. And there is no real secret to how many of these threads you need to put through. You can feel when it starts to feel secure, and at some point the hole of the hook or the eye, depending on which part you're sewing, it won't take any more thread. So if you get to that point, you'll have to move to the next one. Okay, so I'm just going to add one more, and I've gotten to the point where it really won't take much more than that. So just going to pull it through, and then I'll put my needle in just to hide. I don't want any thread just loose about in the top there, so I'm taking it under to get into the other hole. And I'm taking a look at it again to make sure it's still straight. It's still straight, that's good. And then I'll just continue doing that same thing. I remember when I first started sewing, I used to quit projects all the time when I got to the hand stitching because it always seemed so daunting to me. But after you've done a few hook and eyes and you've done a few hems by hand and added lace trim and all these other things, once you've done it a couple of times, it's really not that bad. You get used to it, and sometimes it's nice because that's the kind of stuff that you get to do in front of the TV. And I love any excuse I have to sew, but also get to watch my anime at the same time. Okay, so this is starting to feel very thick, so I think that's a good place to stop. So now I'll just go back through one of my threads over here to kind of tack it down. Okay, and then I'm just going to do my knot there. And I like to do always at least 2. So I do 2 knots there. And then to hide the ends so that they don't stick out, I'll put the needle back through close to my knot. Just run it through in between the layers here. Pop it out the end. And then cut the excess thread off. And that will hide the ends. Okay, so this side is good. That one's all set. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, except with my hook. So this one's a little bit harder to see because it's white on white, but here's my hook. And I'm going to just line up my other hook underneath that one. Oh, it might help if I prep my needle, huh? So I have enough thread on here that I can go ahead and just knot this off and use the rest of this. So I'll just make 2 knots really quickly. Then I want to trim off some of that excess thread. Line up my hook. Once again, keeping it kind of close to the side there. Oh, sorry, and I need to flip this to this side because I'm right-handed. These are always a little trickier to hold. Okay, that's good. And then I'm just gonna start tacking this. Because these are a little bit harder to hold, sometimes I will just tack it down because it's wanting to move on me so much. So I have that tacked down a little. Now I'm going to go ahead and actually go to the other. See how that wants to move so much? They're harder to hold flat. So I'm just going to put my needle through and go to the other hole here. Just get it tacked down because it'll be much easier to work with then. Okay. And it's just going to be the same thing, just sewing until they feel like they're secure. Something else that I like to do whenever I'm doing the hooks, don't do it a lot because it will show through, but sometimes fabric, once you have a garment on, the hook and eyes, sometimes they want to like make the fabric pop up unattractively. So what I'll do is on one of these stitches, I'll actually go through and I'll grab that fabric on the outside, but just barely, just a tiny, tiny bit. And you can check it. So you can't even see my needle there, which means I've just barely grabbed. And I'll pull the needle through, and that's just to kind of secure that material there. So I like doing that. That makes me feel like I get a nicer finish. Okay, so that side's pretty secure, so I'm going to put my needle through, return back to that other side that I haven't finished yet, and just secure it a little more. And you can do the same thing here if you want. If you feel like your fabric's going to pop up on you a little bit, you can take your needle through and just barely grab the right side of the material. Once really is enough. You don't need to do multiple stitches like that. And actually, if you're sewing with cotton, cotton can really take a lot of that. But if you're sewing with something like I don't know, like silk or shantung or more sensitive material like that, I wouldn't recommend doing that because it will show through. All right, now I have to stop because I'm running out of thread. But this feels very secure. So just going to run that through once and then make my knot. And then make one more knot just to really secure it. Then I'm going to run my thread through the middle of the layers and out and trim it again. All right. Now, as long as you laid everything out correctly before you did all of that, if you close this up, and you close both of your hooks, this is what you should have when you're done. Oh, there you go. See? It's nice and pretty. And because we tacked it by just barely grabbing that fabric, it won't pull up like this. So that's what I was trying to explain. Sometimes when I first started sewing, I would work on projects and it would pull up a little bit like that, and I really don't like that. So I do this now and it keeps all of my hook and eyes in place where they're supposed to be. All right, so now we get to move on to buttons and things. So going back to our buttons, remember the side where you made your two notches, those are where we're going to sew buttonholes. So this is the side that has you can barely see these blue blue markings. I have 2 markings. That means that is the buttonhole side. The other side of my dress, where I have just the dots where I marked the middle, see if I can find one. Here we go. Just a blue dot here. That means that is where I'm sewing on a button. So now we need to go to the sewing machine and I'll show you how my machine makes the buttonholes. So in the previous shot, I forgot to show you guys this. I found this shirt. I'm really into recycling material whenever it's possible. I found this shirt at Goodwill. It used to have a tag on it. I took it off, but I think I paid, I think it was like $2.50 for it, and I just did it for the buttons. So I liked these buttons that were actual, you know, vintage buttons, and they were the perfect color for my dress. They look really nice with the dress. They actually pop a little bit more on my fabric than they do on this red shirt. So I am taking the buttons off of my very cheap shirt and I'm going to use them on my dress. Alright, so super easy way to get buttons. The actual material of the shirt, I think the reason they sold it so cheaply is because the shirt is extremely worn. So the material here is really not very useful. It's not something that I would sew anything else with. Usually I like to keep the material and I'll make a purse or something, even if I just use it for a little bit and then give it to a friend or somebody, you know, or even redonate it sometimes. They're just fun for like little extra sewing projects, but this material is extremely worn and you can feel that. So I'm not going to keep this material. It's not useful. But the buttons are in great condition. There's nothing wrong with these buttons. So, woo! I have fantastic actual little vintage buttons now. So the reason I had to show you that really quickly is A, it's fun for me and I like to encourage recycling, and B, because we need it for our buttonholes. So your machine may be different than mine. This is a button foot and it comes with my machine. Most machines will come with a button foot, and I'm just going to put it in the top here and then close it down. And this is what determines the size of the button that I make. So now I'm going to switch out my regular sewing foot with my button foot, like so. Alright, give it a test, make sure it's all working. Then I want to get that thread through the bottom. Ideally you shouldn't use a seam ripper to do that, but I'm being lazy today, so there we go. Let me just put that away. Okay, so you want to make sure the thread is through the hole there. I also have this button foot that I have to bring down, and then I'm going to set the button that I want here. Now my button is round, so I'm going to use number 17 on my machine because that is the round buttonhole stitch. Okay, so this is how I do this on my machine. Your machine could be completely different than mine. You know, Singer, Janome, Brother, there are so many different sewing machines. So if you don't know how your button foot works on your machine, you will have to read that on your machine, or at least YouTube it. I'm sure you can find a video. It's very important to know how to stitch the buttonhole on your machine, okay? So just complete clarity on that. This is how I use mine. So now I'm going to grab a piece of spare fabric and show you how I practice the buttonhole, because it's always good to practice a buttonhole before you start stitching it. Okay, so I know that I have the correct settings for my buttonhole, but what I want to test now is my fabric and also how my machine will stitch a buttonhole. And the reason is because if you look at our buttonhole placement, we have 2 markings, right? So depending on how your machine sews and the size of button you're using, the fabric, this width could be a little bit different. So I'm using a button that is a little bit smaller than what the pattern actually recommended, and it's because I wanted to use those cute vintage buttons that I found. So I need to know when I start my buttonhole, am I starting at the top or the bottom? So in order to test that and also test my fabric, I'm going to take a spare piece of fabric that I have and fold it over because I am sewing through double thickness to do this button. And I'm also going to mark just pretend placement lines. So for example, let's say this is my buttonhole and this is the top and bottom, and if you're nervous that you'll forget which one's the top and bottom, you can actually write it out there if it helps you remember. So I just put a T next to top. So I believe my machine actually starts here and then stitches backwards, so I'm going to start here at this mark. Just want to make sure, yep, that's almost dead on. Alright, so I'll put my needle down, make sure the foot's down, make sure everything's in place, and then I'm just going to start stitching a test button to see what happens. Alright, so the machine basically did all of the work for me, which is why modern sewing machines are awesome. Now it did grab my fabric a little, but that's okay right now because this is a test button, so that doesn't matter. So I was correct in that mine starts here. So if you have two markings, your machine might do something different, but I know that my machine is going to start here, which to me and my perception of where this button is, I would call that the bottom. So depending on you and how you see things, you might see that differently, but this is my buttonhole now. So now what I want to do is grab my actual dress and I'm going to compare the length of that button to what I have here, and they are almost exactly identical in length. In fact, they basically are identical in length. Here's my buttonhole and here are my two markings. That's perfect. So I am ready to actually stitch on my fabric. So I'm going to take my dress and put it through here. This is the real deal now, and I know that I need to start my stitch here at the bottom. So I'm going to pull this through. Take your time in placing the needle because you don't want to do this wrong. Okay, so there. I like to pull the needle down to see if I have it exactly in the middle. I'm double checking to make sure I have the right side. I do have the right side. Okay, that is perfectly in the center. So I'm going to put my needle in, and I'm actually going to stand up and look behind the machine because that's where my other marking is, and make sure that my other marking is in the center of these two pieces because I need to make sure I'm sewing it straight. Okay, so this is good. So I'm just going to gently hold this in place and let the machine do the work for me. Don't pull on the fabric, just gently hold it. You're just offering the machine a little bit of extra help. There it goes, doing the other side. And now it's going to come back and it's going to finish the end of that buttonhole. There we go. So there's my first buttonhole. Thank you. Good little machine. This is my favorite machine. I've had it for years and it's still awesome. Alright, so there's my beautiful buttonhole. Okay? So now I'm going to do that for all the rest of these. It's going to take me a minute or two. I always tell people, don't be scared of buttonholes. Once you know how your machine works, you basically know how to do a buttonhole. So go ahead and finish up all of your buttonholes and come join me again.